fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Today we are talking about a book called Indecent Advances. It's a hidden history of the true crime and prejudice before Stonewall. And with us to talk about this is the author, James Polchin. Thank you for being here, James.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be here.
So, James, I have to start out with saying, what made you write this book? Like, what was the driving force for you?
Right. So, a few years ago, actually several years ago, I came across these scrapbooks at Yale University. I was doing research on Carl Van Vechten, who is this writer and photographer from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He was very key figure for the Harlem Renaissance. He was a big promoter of African-American writers and artists in the 20s and 30s. And he had collected, through this period, he collected what I call kind of ephemera of queer life as well. He was married to a woman, but twice, actually, and but he also had many gay lovers throughout his life. And so he amassed these scrapbooks that included drag ball flyers and advertisements for gay novels at the time. And mixed into these scrapbooks were these clippings of true crime stories from the press. And so I had known about some of this cultural life that he was gathering and pasting into these scrapbooks, but I didn't know about these true crime stories. Some of them, they would have sentences that were underlined, because many of these stories were coded in terms of what their queer subtexts were. And so that started me to think about, well, how is this story of crime and true crime stories in the press, how is this part of a LGBTQ history? And started me sort of digging into newspaper archives and trying to locate more of these kinds of stories.
You know, it's strange. I was watching something with someone from an older show, probably from the 40s or 50s movie, and there was two guys that were kind of flirty with each other, and I said something. I said, "Oh, well, you know what they're going to do later," and she said to me that, "Well, they didn't do that back then." And it kind of floored me in the sense that, what do you mean they didn't do that? Well, they never did that back then. What? You actually think that there were no gay men back then? It never happened, and it just kind of happened. What, 1970? Someone drank the water. I like, what do you? But the thing is, she wasn't being rude or mean. She was actually really believed it. So I think there's a lot of people in the straight world that have no idea that gay men existed in the old times.
I think that's interesting. Like to sort of mark this moment somewhere in the late 60s or 70s. That's when gay men appeared.
Yeah. I because I really don't know what to say to that. I'm just like, well, that's ridiculous. People are people, humans are humans. There's sexuality and all this stuff in it. So it might not be accepted or outwardly, and it's not going to be on your television, and it's not going to be on in the public maybe in certain times, but it's still there. It kind of reminded me of when I think it was the Iranian leader that said, well, we don't have that homosexual problem because we don't have any, right? And you're kind of thinking, well, you couldn't really believe that, right? And there's people that do, and so I think this is an important work, and I hope it really gets into the mainstream.
Well, it's interesting to follow on that thought, because what struck me in so many of these press accounts, that the victims were oftentimes men who were married, oftentimes men who were married with children, and were clearly engaged in homosexual encounters, right? And so, the idea that it sort of also points to the different ideas about sexuality at the time, and how these distinctions of hetero and homo, these distinctions of straight and gay, weren't as defined, right, in this period that I'm looking at, and so it does sort of, I think, make us think about our own identities and the ways in which we organize our sexuality categories today. So, yeah, it's
crazy. So, what was the most? I don't want to say shocking, but what was the one that maybe stuck out most with you in all of your history and researching of the different eras here of homosexuality and how it was perceived, and that was there any surprises for you?
Right. I mean, in some ways, almost all of these stories shocked me. One, in terms of the way in which they were in the press. Some of these stories were buried on page 38 in the bottom, and some of them were on the front page day after day. Increasingly, after World War II, these stories were sensationalized and given more space in the press. But I was one challenge for me in researching, writing this book, was not to mirror the kind of sensationalism in the book that the press was clearly trafficking in terms of these crimes, and really making the headlines and making these really detailed, gruesome descriptions of the crime scenes, right? I wanted to both show the kind of sensationalism and the gruesomeness of these crimes, but also have that kind of empathetic approach to these stories and the men who were victimized in these cases. There's one case in particular that struck me from the 1930s. It was a case involving, it was a double murder, actually, a case involving one victim was in New Jersey, and he was murdered in his apartment. The killer, Kenneth Newey, took his car and drove to New Orleans, where he then encountered a man in a hotel in New Orleans, and seemed to have tried to extort him money, but that didn't work, and then he ended up murdering him in New Orleans. And so this case became quite a sensation, mostly in New Orleans, where he was then tried for that second murder. Mostly he was tried for that second murder because the first murder was clearly a queer encounter, and the New Jersey authorities didn't think they could actually get him convicted on that murder. And so the second case in New Orleans involved a very well-respected married grandfather who was murdered in a hotel room. So that case seemed by the authorities to be more viable to adjudicate. And but Newey was this flamboyant figure. The press named him the killer crooner, because he was a singer on the radio. He was very good looking. He looked like Hollywood actor, but he also had clear kind of psychopathic qualities to him. At his trial, he wore some shoes of one victim and the suit of another victim. I mean, he was very useful character in the sensationalizing in the press around this. One element of this crime that really made me stop in the research when I was doing the research, really stopped me in the moment. The Nui was making the argument that he was insane at the time of the murder, that he was not able to be in control of his actions. And the district attorney actually used the first murder, in which Nui claimed that first victim had come on to him, and that's why he had to kill him. And that's the term Indecent Advances that he used, and many others like him used in the court to claim a kind of innocence in these murders. And so Nui was claiming that he, for the New Orleans murder, that he was temporarily insane at that moment. The DA was claiming that that first murder in New Jersey proves that he's not insane, because what he did to protect himself against the gay man coming on to him proves that that's what any sane man would do. So it was a really shocking and upsetting kind of argument from the DA here that one's violent attack on a gay man's attraction for another man is clear evidence of his sanity, of the killer's sanity, right? So, but those kinds of arguments that, shock us today come up again and again in some of these stories.
In terms of being shocked, that sort of homosexual panic defense is the most chilling, I think in some ways the most chilling part of the book is not the crime, but the idea that these defenses actually worked. I don't know, it's just remarkable.
Right. No, that's true. And you see, in these cases, while they may not always have been acquitted of the murders, they were often given a lesser sentence by claiming homosexual panic, by claiming indecent advances. I needed to protect myself from this other person. And of course, those kinds of arguments, those kinds of defenses trafficked in larger and increasingly through the decades leading up to Stonewall, increasingly an awareness and a cultural figure of a homosexual as a threatening force. So juries really could understand that kind of defense, right? So that, again, I talk about in the book as the ways in which even the victims in these murders were then criminalized and seen as really the perpetrators, right? And so the way that homosexual panic defense really flipped the whole courtroom story.
Pretty amazing. I was going to say we had the author of Tinderbox, Rob Fiesler on, and how he was talking about, that was in 1973, and there was people in the bar that had been up for charges of homosexuality, indecent acts, from 1967. So people really have to realize the differences in just our short lifetimes.
Right. Homosexual panic as a defense continues on, right? Some states have outlawed it. I don't have the exact number right now, but I believe 4 or 5 have outlawed it as a defense in the courtroom. But that's been a recent phenomenon. Though that kind of defense has been really useful, particularly in the last half of the 20th century. And I believe the 2 killers of Matthew Shepard tried to use that defense as well in their trial. And so this is something that as I write in the book, I track the origins of this theory in the post-World War I era in St. Elizabeth Hospital, where doctors were studying sailors and soldiers, many of them who had come through the war, but they were looking at different mental conditions and looking at them in terms of within the context of deviant sexualities, and had developed this whole theory of homosexual panic. And it comes through a kind of Freudian understanding of human psychology, that we're all born bisexual, and then as we grow up and mature, we're supposed to repress our homosexual desires and embrace a kind of heterosexual adulthood. And panic, those moments of panic are when we can't control that other side of us, right? And that theory gets transformed in different ways over the decades, but it becomes such a compelling idea in the courtroom by the 1930s and onward, but it's never really a theory that has been explored much beyond that initial defining in 1921. So, but yet it becomes a compelling legal argument for almost a century now.
Well, I guess they're considering it a mental disorder in those times, so there's something wrong with you. And, I guess that would be the point of view. During the Cold War, how did things change?
Right. Well, two things. It seemed in the crime stories that I looked at in the post-World War II in the late 40s and 50s. One is that as many of us might know, that homosexuality became part of the national threat. It became part of the communist threat, right? It was the expulsion of homosexuals from the State Department, from government, because they were imagined as being security threats for the nation, right? And that played out then as concerns for homosexuals across the country. There was a series of articles about crime in the post-war period. There was a series of articles published in Collier's magazine, which was a fairly middle-class, middle-brow magazine in the period. And many of these articles were focused on the problem of sexual deviancy as well. The reporter would go with the vice squads and report in detail about where homosexual men hung out at bus stations or in parks, and so detailing this kind of world. Now, of course, coupled with that was Kinsey's study of homosexuality that came out in 1948, and that, of course, upended all kinds of ideas about homosexuality as being a kind of marginal condition of a small group of men, right? And what he showed is that homosexuality was much more pervasive across all segments of society, all classes, in different regions of the country. And this really unsettled both cultural ideas and medical ideas about the nature of homosexuality. And so these two kinds of stories were playing out in the crime stories as well. This notion that around any corner it could be a homosexual, but also you don't know who that person might be, right? So the post-war brought this whole idea of queer men as unidentifiable, much like the communist. Who's the neighbor? Let's be suspicious of the people next to us. And Kinsey's theories kind of fed into that as much as they expanded in really useful ways an understanding of homosexuality. So the crime stories really focused on the mysteries of these men. They focused on victims who were could not have been understood as homosexual, but all of a sudden we understand from the life that the reporter is able to write about in the crime itself. So these two factors were really crucial in that period.
Do you think Dr. Kinsey's reports were good and helpful or not?
I think that they certainly were useful in developing a new consciousness about sexuality in the period. As I talk about in the book, theories of homosexuality emerged alongside theories of criminality from the late 19th century on. And one of the crucial elements of both of those theories up until the 1940s was that you were born. These were defective qualities. You were born a pickpocketer, and you were born a homosexual, or you were born an arsonist, right? That crime is something that's genetic, something that's biological, and sexual deviancy as a crime was also seen that way. So by the post-war period, this thinking begins to shift into thinking of homosexuality as a developmental problem, right? That you're not born this way, but it's a problem of parenting, it's a problem of your environment, right? And so Kinsey comes in and kind of unsettles both of those theories and talks about, again, this kind of broader experience of homosexuality across different classes, across geographies. And so in many ways, he's able to help and foster the early homophile movements of the 1950s into the 1960s, seeing homosexuality as not this kind of disease condition of a minority of people, but rather seeing it as a more pervasive kind of practice, and was very useful in that way.
So when someone picks up your book here and reads it, what do you want them to get out of that?
That's always a good question and a tough question. I think, these stories are, for the most part, these stories haven't been read since they were first published. Going to the New York Times Index, for example, for the 1940s, you can't go in the index and say, oh, let's look up queer murders or gay murders. There's no listing of that, right? These were stories that have really been forgotten. But these are stories, I think, that really illuminate a kind of criminalization of queer people, right? We kind of know, right, that the laws were in place, that we know about that there were police raids on the streets and in bars in Greenwich Village or in certain bars in Los Angeles. We know that these were happening in a kind of abstract sense. What these crime stories show us is how these practices actually played out, both in the press and in the crime, in the courtroom as well. And so one thing I really want folks to see is this kind of legacy of what happens when you criminalize a group of citizens and then you harness the medical field and the media to amplify this kind of criminalization.
So if we, speaking of that, if we take a person that was living in the Leave It to Beaver era, you're in the 60s here, married, kids, job, and you're homosexual, but under the cover. So you get caught in a situation with involved in some sort of sexual scandal with another man, what would happen to you in your life?
Well, there many things could be threatened in that situation, right? You could lose your job. You could often would be arrested. I talk about a case in Ohio in 1962, and it was a public restroom in the middle of town that the police had created a sting operation around, and they had actually positioned a cameraman with a small handheld camera behind a two-way mirror in the bathroom to capture evidence of men having sex or soliciting each other, and then the cameraman would use his walkie-talkie to announce to a policeman outside, and then they would be arrested. And, most of those men were married, many of them with kids, and they would lose their job, their name would be in the paper, they would be either sentenced to prison, or they would be often sentenced to mental institutions where they would be put under various painful treatments to change them, right? One of the effects of thinking of homosexuality as a developmental problem, that it's out of poor parenting or because of the environment you grew up in, is the idea that you can make them change, right? You can give them a certain kind of treatment to change them, and we see that a lot in the arrest of these men and the effort to then either imprison them or oftentimes subject them to treatments.
Pretty amazing. I remember when I was listening to your book, there was a story about the man that was at the subway bathroom and got killed, and you talked about how in the paper it was just talked about as a murder. Nothing about it was a cruising bathroom that people went to. Right.
Yes, that was I think that was a 1936 case. That this is the challenge of the research. The press was reluctant to be explicit with a lot of these stories. Again, after World War II, they were more eager to be explicit because it fit into a broader concern about homosexuals on the home front. But before World War II, there was a lot of innuendo, a lot of coded language. In that case, New York City, Times Square, subway station, if you begin to put that in context of the period, you see how that murder was a kind of pickup that had gone, a robbery that was turned into a pickup that was turned deadly. And the press, though, at that time would not have named it as such. One thing that is very clear from all these accounts I researched, there was very little sympathy for any of these victims. And the idea that a homosexual could be a crazed killer is clear in the press. The idea that the homosexual could be an innocent victim is not in these press reports. And so, and in fact, some of these accounts, you have the discovery of the crime scene and the victim, but the press is reporting it as initial account of the crime, not knowing what happened. Once it's reported that the crime involved or other men, it involved homosexual pickup of some sort, then the press completely kind of ignored any details about the victim. Initially, they may be empathetic to the victim. Once the queer subtext becomes clearer, then the victim becomes really marginal to the story.
When do you think that's changed?
Has it changed?
Well, that's what that brings up the conversation. Do you think, how far has it gone, and how much has it changed? I mean, technically, in some countries, gay rights have gone a long way. In Canada, it's part of the Charter of Rights, and you can't get fired. It's come a long way, and there's actually laws on the book about marriage. The U.S., it's more about a Supreme Court, a ruling, and you can still get fired in a lot of states, and there's still a lot of issues. So, but do you think that the overall thought, like what I'm saying is, when you take a gay man that's been a victim of a crime, it's changed in the sense that the media, in general, doesn't look at that as, well, he was gay, so he deserved it, or they don't walk away from it. They actually talk about it.
Right. No, I think that's true. I think that the media, the press has come a long way through activism of the 70s and 80s, pushing back on the kinds of stories and how these crimes were reported on. I think laws have changed as well, so those kinds of prejudices may not be playing out as acutely as they were before Stonewall in those days. I think still that for people of color, for trans citizens, I think that their stories are still not as public. I think that cases of murders for those communities are not very well reported, and certainly not in mainstream press in any way. And I think that's still efforts to make real accounting. I also think how those cases play out in the justice system still is layered with a lot of discrimination around it. So there's still efforts there to change the ways in which these crimes are understood, and the way in which we understand the victims of these crimes, right? As victims.
In D.C., it's so true that the trans community is not reported accurately or nearly enough. I'm kind of curious historically, did you run across in your research any sort of intersectionality between was there a difference the way they might treat a black gay man versus a white gay man? Would he be more reported? Would he be reported at all? I'm just curious. Did you run across any of that, or maybe you didn't because it's not there in the newspapers?
Right. So there is. Yeah, I do talk about a number of cases, mostly in the 40s and 50s, where it was either two African American men, one murders the other, or the victim is a white man and the killer is an African American man. And it was interesting because, of course, I say this in the book, the crime pages were as segregated as the rest of society was at that time. So it was rare to find any article about an African American man being murdered in the mainstream press within this context. What I did encounter was this particular case, a couple of cases actually, where the victim was a white man, and it was in the New York Times. It was sort of in the mainstream press and got some publicity around that. There was a really sensational case that of an African American man killing another African American man in Brooklyn in the mid-1950s. It was a case that I had to dive into the African American press to really get the details on. And in those articles, they talked about how it was the most difficult case that the Brooklyn Police Department had seen in decades. Yet there was not one mention of it in New York Times or any of the mainstream New York newspapers, right? I only sort of found it through African American press. And so in that respect, yeah, that sort of shows the ways in which these crimes and the story of these kinds of crimes did fall along racial lines.
Absolutely.
Well, I wonder too. Now, how much did you come across people that were cross-dressing and that kind of storyline in the old times?
That is funny because I was, again, the research here was fascinating for me, but also maddening because I would use the newspaper databases, right? So many of these newspapers now have been digitalized. So you can go into these databases and do a search for key terms, something that you can't do in microfilm back in the day. And so this is how I was finding a lot of these stories, just using keywords like sailor found murdered in hotel, and then sifting through all the articles within a certain time period and seeing what sort of comes out of that. And I was doing searches for cross-dressing or any female impersonator was a term that was often used in that period, and not finding very much around that. A couple of cases in the 30s that I talk about, but not a lot was coming out. Now, again, what I'm looking at is how these stories are making it into a public space in the press itself, right? And how the press reports on it and how different newspapers report on it in different ways. It also speaks to the fact that this is probably nowhere near the extent to these kinds of crimes, right? It's just the crimes that made it into the press. And so there weren't that many cases that I could find around female impersonators or cross-dressers in this period.
Wow. So where do you want to go next after this book, and do you want to continue on this type of research?
I do. I do think that queer true crime research is really fascinating and can really open up new ways of recovering histories that have been lost to us, and possibly, right, that kind of intersectional qualities of these histories. And I do think I'm fascinated by crime in a historical context and what happens when we look at crime stories or a crime. What windows does it give us into queer experience, right? And so I do want to look more historical true crime and see how that can, again, open up sort of new ways into queer experience in the past. Historians do and have focused a lot on the kind of cultural life of queer experience, right? I think a lot of the histories that we have are about the ways in which men and women have been able to survive and find a world and find a life for themselves despite the criminalizations, despite the discriminations that they had to endure. What I'm interested in is how those kinds of criminalizations and how those discriminations were experienced or represented, right, in the criminal justice system, in the press, in novels or films or whatever that is, right? So how crime, which has been such a compelling framework for homosexuality for so long, what can that help us see or understand about sexuality more generally?
How's the feedback been? Have you had any negative backlash on this?
I haven't. So, yeah, I'm always ready for something.
Well, nowadays you have to be. Yeah. There's all sorts. So
yeah, I haven't had too much negative. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, someone having a bad day could give you negative feedback, right? I mean, you just never know. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No. There has been some kind of comment about my use of the word queer throughout the book, and why I don't use, say, gay, or why I don't use LGBTQ all the time. And so that has been some of the feedback. Of course, as I mentioned before, so many of these victims would not identify themselves as gay at the time, right? They wouldn't, they're married, they have children, they might have had sexual encounters with men occasionally throughout their lives, right? So I use this term queer and queer to crime because I wanted to think about the broader understanding of the victims of these kinds of crimes.
So what is that term about? So when you say queer men, so for the listeners that are totally unaware of what that means, how would you give a definition to that?
Right. I think that these men in these stories live their life mostly as what we would call straight men for a number of these men in the book. There are some that were clearly living their life as what we might say a gay man today. So for me, queer is a useful framework to think about that bigger, what Kinsey called this Kinsey scale, right? This bigger container that men experienced sexual encounters while still being married and having kids. I don't want to conjecture and say, well, they were just gay, but they were repressed, because, of course, that also denies any sense of bisexuality. And so, it's like I want to have a term that can talk about the range of experiences here.
Okay. Now, do you have a website or a place people can go and find out more about you and what you do?
Right, yes. You can go to jamespolchin.com, and there's more information about the book. There's a Q&A and other links to interviews I've done about the book as well.
Fantastic. Okay. We will have your book and website listed on ours as well, and we appreciate you coming here and talking about the book. Do you think that current conditions and the climate of the U.S. right now is it something to be worried about? As far as homosexuality and all that. Absolutely.
I think that this one of the things I want to do in this book is to remind us of how easy it is to criminalize groups of people, and again how that criminalization gets played out in across different parts of society, in the media, in the medical establishments, in other areas, and how that gets becomes a kind of compelling idea about those people. And so I think right now we are in a moment where people are being criminalized in very horrible ways that we need to be very aware of and respond to.
Wow. So you think we can actually unsee or unring the bell that's been rung? Like, how can we go back into the closet, so to speak?
Well, there's plenty of folks who are in positions of power now who would like to repeal gay marriage, who would like to return to a period where gay men, LGBTQ people, and broadly are recriminalized or criminalized in more dire ways than they are now. So I think, yeah, I don't hold up any sense that we have passed the point where we need to worry about that. I think that our rights are always under threat, and we need to be vigilant for that.
Well, something to think about. Again, well, thank you very much for talking about this, and it's an important book and subject.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, James.
We interrupt our programming. This is a national emergency. Important details will follow.
Are you prepared? Legacy Food Storage. The best way to protect your family is by being prepared. Go now to legacyfoodstorage.com. Use coupon code HOM15 now for 15% off. Quick, go!
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll see you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.